So, have you ever had that experience where you've been away from a town for a while, maybe 5, 10 years? Maybe you've been off to college and you come back for a period of time to visit your hometown and it looks different or it feels different or the people seem different and you're a little bit disappointed that the places you used to have fun are gone or the people are gone and it just feels wrong and you really have this nostalgia for what used to be and a dislike of what's come. And when you talk to the people you know there, you talk to your folks or you talk to your friends who stayed behind and they don't notice the change. For them, life just kind of went on and they don't understand what the big deal is, what you're complaining about. If you ever had this experience, then you'll understand what's going on with what's happening to the main character in Philip K. Dick's fourth novel, The Cosmic Puppets. Now, Dick is not known for writing very long novels, and this is one of the shortest. It's almost novella length, and I think there might be a couple of his novellas which are near this long. In this edition, the Mariner edition I have, it only comes into 136 pages, and the next novel I'll be looking at, Eye in the Sky, is like 250. Now, yeah, most of his novels hover around 200 pages, but this one is still significantly shorter than some of the others you read. It's a very, very quick read. You can get through it sort of in one sitting or maybe a couple sittings. And so in that sense, it's worth investing in. It's not one of his most well-known novels. It's not one of his best, but it's an important work because I think it represents a shift in Dick's career. In his first three novels, now setting aside the short stories, because that's a whole other narrative, but looking at his novels, his first three novels deal with political dystopias. In Solar Lottery, you have a type of randomocracy and a sort of quasi-neo-feudalism. In The World Jones Made, you have a world based on the principle of relativism where no one is allowed to express an opinion of any sort. And then in The Man Who Japed, you have a moral conservative order. And in all those three, we're really the story focuses on the political machinations within that system and how that system can be overturned or transformed or renewed in some way. So I think in those three books, he's being anti-Orwellian, while Orwell sees the political dystopia as eternal and unescapable and kind of just something we're stuck with for all eternity, right? In Dick, he's not happy with that, so he does give ways out. So, for instance, in The World Jones Made, it's the frontier. It's a new generation that can live on the frontier. In The Man Who Japed, it's just a sense of humor. It's the way we can escape that. Anyways, with Cosmic Puppets, he sets aside these issues and he writes a series of novels, and I'm thinking of four in particular: The Cosmic Puppets, Eye in the Sky, The Man in the High Castle, and Time on a Joint, all of which are about false fronts, false realities, and he plays with different reasons why there's a false reality, why, sometimes it's political, sometimes it's cosmic, sometimes it's practical, but he's playing with different reasons the world we live in is false. And in a way, The Man in the High Castle, the last of these, is a meta-analysis of this theme. And so in this sense, The Cosmic Puppets really represents a turn in Dick's career where he really starts to take on and hold with both hands this theme of what is real and why are things not real. Right? It's not just a matter of what is real. I don't even Dick even said it. Like, it's one of his main questions is what is real. But I think it's more than what is real. It's like, why isn't the world that we see real? And I think getting at the political motivations behind it grounds these more metaphysical texts in something very meaningful. In his first attempt at doing this, The Cosmic Puppets, it's purely a cosmic, almost religious exploration of this theme. So The Cosmic Puppets explores a few days in the life of our main character, Ted Barton. Ted Barton is a man who left his hometown as a boy and has always missed it and always wanted to come back. And he's kept almost a near photographic memory of this town, something that he reinforces with constant stories he tells his wife, nearly to the point where his wife is disturbed and bothered and annoyed at his constant talking about his quaint little hometown, his wife very much as a city girl. But on a trip to the south from New York City, they do a stop in this town called Millgate, Virginia, his hometown. And he goes into the town basically as a side trip on the vacation. He wants to check it out for a day. And what he realizes right away is the town is entirely different. It's not just the general store's been torn down and there's a Walmart there. It's a much more fundamental change. Even the old buildings, the buildings that are old and look old, are not the same old buildings that they were when he was a kid. When he was a kid. So the buildings that appear to be 50, 60 years old or 100 years old are also different. So the whole town has changed, transformed. And then we have a mystery of why this happened, who's doing it, what forces are at work here, and about his own past. He starts to have worries about his own past and his own memories and what he understands about the world. So he becomes obsessed with this. His wife goes to a hotel and basically leaves him because she's so annoyed that he's distracted by this. Ted Barton then goes and starts to investigate. He starts by looking up his own history and finds that he was supposed to have died during the scarlet fever epidemic. He meets different people. Particularly, he meets a young girl named Mary Mead, and a young boy. They're both around this. They appear to be the same age, Peter Trilling, both of whom we know have special powers to control animals. Mary can control the bugs of the sky, moths and bees. Peter can control spiders and snakes, and he can actually make golems out of clay. And they're in some sort of conflict, and they seem to have divided up the town into their own zones. He also meets at some point a man named William Christopher. William Christopher, he is a drunk, and Ted Barton learns very quickly that William Christopher remembers the old town, but he doesn't remember it very well because he's seen the change and he's lived in the new Millgate for so long. But he also reveals that he knows how to bring stuff back, and he can do it at a small scale. He can transform a bottle of wine into a coffee grinder, or he can change I forget what it is, but some other item into a tire iron that they both understood, that they both remember. A tire iron which was owned by a particular character in the old town. So the possibility of restoring the town is there. Then, now there's also wanderers in this town, and the people who live in Millgate seem not bothered by this. It seems completely normal for them, but the wanderers are like ghost-like spirits that would just walk through town and drift through, and everyone thinks that's normal except Ted and, of course, William Christopher. They work together to begin restoring a park, which they do. They restore the park to its old ways. Peter realizes that he loses his power in these restored areas, so he starts to panic. He uses his creatures to kill Mary, who he sees as his great nemesis. And Ted then later on talks to Mary Mead's father, Dr. Mead, who seems to have some also awareness of what's going on in this town. And this leads to a big battle in which the Wanderers, who are trying to restore the town, ally with Ted Barton to try to work on this, but this is all interrupted by a big cosmic battle in which Mary reappears in the form of a golem. She's actually put her consciousness in one of Peter Trilling's golems. And she tells him, I didn't bring you here for quote-unquote civic restoration. I brought you here to awaken my father. Her father turns out to be Ormazd, the great Zoroastrian deity. And Peter Trilling, in contrast, is an avatar of Ahriman, the destroyer god, who is the dominant force in this remade new Millgate. Ted manages to free Dr. Mead, or free Ormazd from the avataric form of Dr. Mead, and then Ahriman and Ormazd, these two deities in perpetual eternal conflict, continue their struggle. The town is slowly restored, and Mary kind of tells what's going on. Mary is in fact Ormazd's daughter, Arimati. And that's basically the story of the Cosmic Puppets. Like I said, it's a very short read. And not that much happens. In fact, much of the novel is a bit of a throwaway because there's so much emphasis put on the first half and even the first 2/3 of the novel on this idea of restoring the old Millgate. And Mary at the end says, that's not what you're here for. You're here for something else, and that is for liberating a kind of an entrapped deity, which he does. And then, but this is interesting because the potential emerges for a type of civic restoration that kind of can create a third Millgate. Not the original Millgate, not the new false Millgate, but a third Millgate. And I'll get to that when I look at some of the themes of this novel. The characters in the story, none of them are very notable, I guess. Ted Barton is not the most likable person. He seems very indifferent to his wife. He doesn't really understand her. He seems obsessed with his own past and his childhood. He's often a jerk to the people he meets. But thankfully, we don't spend a lot of time with him in the short novel. But Dick has not created one of his more compelling and sympathetic characters in Ted Barton. The other character we have is William Christopher, who we basically see only as a drunk, who is dealing with the fact that his whole world has changed with alcoholism. In a sense, he's very much like a kind of the cliched member of the underclass who can't handle the new world order, and just turns to drugs and alcohol to deal with that. Still holding out hopes of restoring things the way they are, but in fact, it's simply just, he's dealing with his problems through chemical abuse of various types. The most fascinating characters are probably Mary Mead and Peter Trilling, who we meet as we think they're just boys, a young boy and a young girl, and they're playing with each other, but they are able to play by commanding bugs, and they can manipulate golems and things. It turns out they're avatars of cosmic deities. But it's interesting, there's an open question when the novel goes on about why they can do this. And Dick has a little bit of fun with their different abilities and how they play with their abilities and experiment with them and try to learn to do new things. And I think Mary reaches the ultimate when she's able to take over one of Peter's golems and split her consciousness between the golem and her human form. And this actually lets her survive when her body is consumed by Peter's creepy crawlies. And I will also note that Mary takes the form of a girl and can control kind of the sweet, nice animals of the yard, right? The moths and the bees, while Peter Trilling has all the creepy, icky, grounded creatures. It's very much like that poem, the boys are this way, girls are sugar and spice and everything nice, and boys are snails and toads and puppy-dial tails, or however the poem goes. It's kind of you're reminded of that as you read the story. So the characters aren't nothing too much to speak of. Again, we don't spend too much time with any of them, so it's not a big deal that none of the characters are incredibly notable. But that's all I have to say about the characters. As for the themes, this is where this book really is interesting. And I think the dominant theme of this story is urban restoration and urban renewal and the remaking of our cities. It's not insignificant that Dick calls this story the Cosmic Puppets, and it's a story about the city and how the city's made. Although it's set in a small town, you could set this anywhere, right? And this experience that he describes is an experience so many of us have had. Even in the 1950s, it was a common experience. America was changing. It was becoming much more suburban. And he talked about this in other novels like The Commuter, or in stories like The Commuter and In Small Town, and even The World She Wanted. These are short stories where Dick explores with this theme of some foul power, some force, having the ability to transform cities out from under people's feet, and how that affects them and how it changes their life, and how they come to terms with the fact that they have no control over the city. In a sense, it's very much thematically tied to the idea of the right to the city, which is a theory proffered, I think, in the 50s or 60s, really about as culture becomes more urban, or the world becomes more urban, the struggle for freedom and democracy must be at the realm of the city and at the city governance. And various people have written about this. So Henri Lefebvre, he wrote the original manifesto on the right to the city, but David Harvey, a Marxist geographer, has done a lot of work on this, and Murray Bookchin, in a very different way, has explored the idea of the city as the center of our civic life and our identity and our political action. So the idea here becomes, how do we take the city and manipulate it and change it in ways that liberate us, to make us freer, to make us happier, to achieve our goals and our desires, rather than giving it to other forces that we can't control. Like here, they're represented by gods, but of course, if you've studied any of the history of the world's cities, you find figures like Robert Moses in New York City, who was never elected in the office, but had all the power to determine where roads went, where parks went, and in consequence, underdeveloping and developing whole neighborhoods, and no one ever voted for him. So there are these forces, the urban planners, the developers, all the people in various civic planning organizations that have immense powers over our lives. And the more and more our lives are tied to the city, the more important it is that we demand the right to make the cities in our own image. And I think that's why this novel is very interesting for us, is because it takes this very important political question we're facing and puts it in an interesting science fiction or fantasy novel. So one last thing about the city. So Ted Barton comes to this town and he finds it completely changed. And his motivation for much of the novel is to restore it to the old way it used to be, right? Just to go back. And then, you know, he's like the Trump voter who just doesn't like the changes he sees in the world and can only think of going back to the 1950s or going back to the time before, right? Restore the old. And Christopher kind of has the same idea. He can't handle this new world he lives in. The Wanderers, who also are motivated to transform the city, they just want to go back to the way things are too. There's two problems with this. One problem is expressed directly in the book, is that the new people who have lived their lives in this town, who aren't part of the old town, will have their lives extinguished. And so what's the morality of going back to the way things are when, you know, people have lived and grown up in this new city, in this new form, and they're used to it? Right? And then it's all very banal. The other problem, less subtly stated, is it's all pretty banal to just go back to the way things are. And Mary at one point even says, I did not bring you here for this silly game of bringing back the old city. You're here for much greater things. And what is that greater thing? Well, I think it's really about creating a third Millgate, a third opportunity, a third potential, right? And that's one in which the people, wanderers and the new city dwellers, you know, can create the city on their own terms without respect to how things were and without respect to the demands of Ahriman and Ormazd and these other deities who have come to control their life and the world they live in. This is one of the first works where Dick is taking on seriously religion kind of on its own terms. In many of his stories up to this point, Dick has played with the idea of religions as having explanations, and he would use science fiction to explain the origin of religions. And he does this in really two stories in particular. One is called The Skull, in which he basically explains the death of Jesus and his later appearance through time travel, right? So he goes back in time, he's seen by people, goes back in time a few days, and at that point he's killed. So this explains the resurrection story. And then there's one that tries to explain the body, not the body, the Bible. It tries to explain the Bible through time travel and some kind of warping of time and space. And that story is called Prominent Author. And there's a few others that play with religion in this way. In this novel, the Zoroastrian deities are real forces. So it's a real religion in the sense that these gods actually exist. So it's not trying to explain it through science. So he just takes for granted that these gods exist to tell a story about the city and how we experience changes in our city. And one final theme that is important to mention here is family. The families here are all presented as very flawed and troublesome and problematic, particularly Peg Barton and Ted Barton. Now, Peg Barton spends most of the novel in her hotel room calling her divorce lawyer. But this is only after a lot of backstory, which we don't all get, in which Ted has basically nagged his wife to the point where she has no choice but to get a divorce. And she's very indifferent to this cosmic event that's happening to him, right? I mean, yeah, she doesn't want to visit Millgate, but her husband is telling her that this is not the world I grew up in. Something really weird is going on here, and she's completely indifferent to it. So there's been a lot of past that we're not privy to. But this was a broken marriage before the novel even began. And it's a thing that Dick didn't have to put in the novel. It's not necessary. He doesn't need to have this relationship there. It could have just been a single guy visiting. But he puts in this marriage, and in doing so, he, I guess, is just presenting another flawed and troubled marriage, which is something he likes to do a lot in his stories. But here it's really redundant or completely unnecessary, but I think it just reminds us how much marriage and the fractured marriage and the broken marital covenant is on his mind in a lot of these early works. Well, so that does it for The Cosmic Puppets. It's a really fun novel. It's if you read Philip K. Dick's work, you probably should come across it. It doesn't take long to read. I recommend it. I think it's a really good entryway into his series of novels exploring false fronts, and I think it should be read with those books. It should be read alongside Eye in the Sky and The Man in the High Castle and Time Out of Joint, because they all are kind of showing Dick trying to come at this theme in different ways, and sometimes more successful, sometimes less successful, but it has a lot to offer. So I those are my thoughts on the Cosmic Puppet. If you want to know more of my thoughts on it, I've done a 4-part podcast series, and I'll put the links for it below, or I'll put a link to my podcast below. And if it's not up now, it'll be up shortly, so you can hear a little bit more of my thoughts on this novel and a little bit more detail on the plot. But those are my thoughts. So thank you so much for watching. If please leave your comments below. Please share this and subscribe to my channel. I'll have more commentary on Philip K. Dick's works, as well as the works of some other American writers. I'm doing reviews of the Library of America series, and I'm doing some other things as well, which I'll put up in different playlists as I produce more content. So, thanks.